Good afternoon to everyone here, and as I've just found out, to the world online. This is Stephen Isenberg. I'm here with Mike Peters. Let me tell you very briefly a bit about ourselves. Mike is a graduate of West Point. He was a combat officer in Vietnam. He was a military attaché in Russia. He worked in the Pentagon. He was number 2 at the Council on Foreign Relations and was once the president of St. John's. I was a newspaper publisher and chief of staff to former Mayor John V. Lindsay of New York. The format for today is that I will ask Mike questions, interceding at some point, and once I think the clock has run for enough of that, we're going to open it to people who are here in the audience. I'm mindful that at about 10 to 2, there are some people who have to leave for the 2 o'clock classes. I said it last year, I'll say it again. Alas and regretfully, we are here again about the Ukraine. So Mike, I want you to pretend that this is a National Security Council meeting, and the opening question is to you, Colonel Peters. Give us, in the language of that setting, a sit rep, or for the rest of you, a situation report on the Ukraine today. Box the compass. Give us the full circumference on military, diplomatic, morale, armament, rules of weaponry, those big points, and then from there we'll try to enter each of those more deeply and fully.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks to everyone for coming out today. So I guess I would say 2 things to start with. The first thing is, unfortunately, the Russian army is learning. The outset, they performed miserably. Their leadership was horrible. Corruption was rampant. That's probably not changed too much, and they performed terribly on the battlefield. But like all armies, once the first shot is fired in combat, you start to learn and you start to adapt, and that's what the Russian army has done. And the political class, Putin himself has learned. He has recognized that this is going to be potentially a long, drawn-out conflict, and he's organizing his government, he's organizing his society, he's organizing his army for a sustained campaign. He's done that in a couple of ways. New leadership, significantly a new Minister of Defense who is an economist, whose background is in industrial relations, and he's put him in place in order to put the Russian economy on more of a war footing. He's got new commanders in the field. The one person he hasn't changed, which is actually kind of interesting, is the Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov. My guess is that that's coming down the line, but Putin moves very deliberately in these kinds of things. And at some time in the probably not too distant future, we'll have a new Chief of the General Staff as well. The one thing he hasn't done is truly mobilize the manpower of Russia. He hasn't increased the size of the draft. He has used a number of other mechanisms to try to increase the number of people on the battlefield, principally by focusing the attention of the draft on the non-urban areas, the non-Russian areas of Russia, so the minorities. And of course, you've all read about the fact that he's uses prisoners and others as battlefield fodder, if you will. The second thing I would say is that the Ukrainians who for so long had the initiative in this struggle now do not. Russia has the initiative. They are establishing the rules of engagement. They are making they're taking the war to the Ukrainians, both on the front line and of course back in the rear area. Their focus on destroying the infrastructure of Ukraine. And of course, we've all read about the most recent strike on the hospital in Kyiv. They've been able to do that because of the failure of the Ukrainians in the much talked about and vaunted counteroffensive that was supposed to take place last summer, fall, and which kind of dribbled out into almost nothing. And they've been able to do it because the West has not provided them with the resources to be able to contain the Russians and indeed to go on the offensive. Of course, on the diplomatic side, today is the beginning of NATO summit. There's going to be a pledge, as I understand it, of about $43 million a year in military aid on the part of NATO nations. Big news, 23 of the NATO countries have met their 2% percentage of GDP to their defense budget. And the NATO is more solidly together, with the possible exception of Hungary, than it has been in some time. And of course, it's larger now because it includes both Finland and Sweden. But two of the principal nations are facing turbulence in their governments. France just went through an election. It's not clear who's going to be in charge, of course, but what we do know is Macron won't be. And so his rhetoric and support for Ukraine is going to be constrained by the realities of the political situation in France. And of course, there's an election in the United States, and I guess I probably don't have to tell this group anything more about what the implications of that might be in the future. On the Russian side, they have solidified relationships with, once upon a time, were known as rogue states, Iran, North Korea, and have had continuing substantial support from China. The countries in the middle, if you will, have remained solidly in the middle, refusing to take sides in the conflict, which has further emboldened the Russians. And of course, you all probably saw today that Modi of India, one of the principal middle states, if you will, Modi went to Russia and hugged Vladimir Putin, which does not bode well for the future in Ukraine. I think I'll stop with that and then go from there.
Let's go back on the issue of the first one, what's been learned. Should we be chastened by the fact that initially there was a lot of satisfaction among Western governments in the fact that Putin didn't just go right in and take over everything and win it as we thought he thought. I mean, it seemed to me that we ought to look back, hang our heads a little, and think, well, maybe we were smug about the size, the scale, the staying power, the adamancy of Russia and how it wages war, and that early on we took too much from the initial failure.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we were surprised initially by how inept the Russian army actually was. I think we had expectations that they were going to be much more capable than they were, and they performed absolutely abysmally. But what we failed to do is to recognize that Putin was fully committed to this endeavor, and that early failure was not going to deter him from ultimately trying to achieve the objectives that he set out to achieve in the first place. And, you know, as I say, over time, and given time, any army will learn and adapt and be able to be more effective. And of course, the Russian army has changed its tactics. They're not trying to launch large ground strikes. They're working, you know, in essentially an attrition operation along their borders with what's left of free Ukraine.
I'm going to come to the issue of armaments and constraint, but I think the follow-up question really ought to be, how good was our assessment, filled with our sympathy, of course, and our admiration for the Ukrainians, of the Ukrainians' capabilities?
You know, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, I think as we were surprised by the ineptitude of the Russian army, we were also pleasantly surprised by how capable the Ukrainians turned out to be. But what and partly that was as a result of some of the things that we'd given them before, Javelin missiles, for example, which were very, very effective when the Russian army was operating in the open, without air cover and air defense. But over time, just the pure numbers would tilt the balance toward the Russians, and our hesitancy to provide the Ukrainians with any kind of capability that allowed them to strike deeply behind the lines, to protect their airspace, to at least provide themselves with air parity, if not air superiority, has helped turn the tide.
Well, let's go right from that then into what was the effect, if any, of the GOP's holdup of military aid to the Ukraine? To what extent did our dilatory political process have any effects? And secondly, let's talk about the rules of engagement that as to where Ukraine can strike back and how, because of the continual fretting that there comes a point where too far into Russia, too much runs the risk of a greater war, a world war.
Well, the holdup in funding has one very principal result, which is the lack of air defense. And the Russians have taken great advantage of that, and they've not only have they used their numbers to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense, but they've also learned in the electronic warfare sphere. They're a lot more sophisticated in how to jam the Ukrainian air defenses, to how to counter their drones. And so they've really developed a capability to do that. And the lack of resources on the part of the Ukrainians for air defense has been, well, we've seen the evidence on the ground. I mean, it has led to a threat of the collapse of their electrical grid, their road systems. You know, the one area where the Ukrainians have succeeded and succeeded amazingly is in the Black Sea. And it's kind of been the reverse. The Ukrainians have used drones and other undersea drones and other kinds of things to push the Russian Black Sea fleet out of Sevastopol, which is where their headquarters would normally be, back to Novorossiysk. And that's allowed them to open the eastern part of the Black Sea, which allowed them to continue to export grain, which has been a huge benefit for them, for their economy, and also obviously a benefit to the world economy. So it's, you know, it's been profound. But I have to say, the Ukrainians bear some responsibility for this as well. Because as I say, Putin hasn't fully mobilized the manpower of the Russian state, but neither has Zelensky. Zelensky has been really reluctant to increase the age range for the draftees, to enforce the draft requirements. As a result of that, the Ukrainian army is really short of manpower and has been using up its trained manpower and ground up in the continuing war with Russia.
Well, isn't that a contrast between Putin's political topography in Russia? As you say, he can go to the non-Russian areas, he can summon those people. Those areas are least open to any communications from the West, and their news consumption, I'm sure, is very different than the people in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. The notion of an unhappy populace, no matter how great the losses, the futility of sort of the Russian mother, who's lost her son, it looks like there's absolutely no way to mobilize any kind of anti-war movement inside of Russia. So like everything else you've got to reckon with in Russia is that Putin, does as he pleases, and thus Zelensky, of course, faces politically a very different situation. I wonder if you could kind of talk a bit more about the Ukraine and in terms of sort of what the political topography is there.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Zelensky has to be concerned about popular opinion. He has to be concerned about the trade-offs. He also has to be concerned about not taking resources away from the economy, especially the defense-oriented economy and the innovations that they can come up with and to put them on the battlefield. And Putin faces fewer of those constraints. I would not say that Putin is totally unconstrained, because I think that the fact that he is not willing, or has not been willing up until now, in order to do a full mobilization is a result of his reading of what the Russian people would, quote unquote, tolerate from that. And he's been very careful to try to, as we talked about before, to protect especially the Russian-speaking major metropolitan areas from being overly impacted by the war. And his economic team has done a fantastic job of keeping the Russian economy perking amidst all the sanctions and everything else that have been laid upon them. So, so it's a different dynamic, obviously, between the two nations in that.
How would you describe then the role and composition of morale in Russia and in the Ukraine?
Well, the Ukrainians that are committed, that are on the front line, I think the best I can tell is their morale is extremely high. I mean, they're totally dedicated to what's going on. They're committed to the cause. They believe in what they're doing, and that makes a difference on the battlefield. On the Russian side, I think the morale of their frontline soldiers is arguably probably pretty miserable. They're not trained well. Some of them, as we've talked about before, are prisoners. They've been used in frontal attacks where just throw manpower at weapons. And they've been, up until recently, fairly poorly led. But I think it was Napoleon that once said that quantity has a quality all of its own, and the quantity is clearly on the Russian side, both in terms of manpower and in terms of other resources that they have to put into the battle.
Could you talk with some particularity about what are possible loosenings of constraints on the Ukrainians? What could you foresee possibly being done to go onto Russian soil, or how do you choose those targets with a very military rationale, and what might that look like?
Well, the biggest thing is to be able to, and the constraints are slowly being relaxed, and unfortunately that's been the history of at least the U.S. reaction to this and others in the West, that we kind of, we creepingly increase the capabilities, and understandably so. I mean, there is, concern about the war spilling over and more directly involving the NATO countries. But the first thing that the Ukrainians need to be able to do is to ensure that the Russians can't turn these small tactical victories that they're having into operational victories, meaning that they can't turn a small incursion into a substantial penetration that ultimately might break through the defensive positions and lead to a warfare in open country in Ukraine. And the way they can do that is by having the resources to strike the operational reserves, to strike the headquarters, to strike the logistical bases. Some of those are in Russia themselves, and some of it, of course, are in Crimea and the other occupied territories. If they can do that, then they can disrupt the Russian ability to make substantial gains on the battlefield and allow the possibility that they might be able to engage in a counterattack at some point in the future. Although I have to say, I remain fairly convinced, as I was, unfortunately, when we first met here after the first year, in the first year of the war, that this is ultimately going to end up in a stalemate, that the lines are going to be roughly the same as they are right now, and there's going to be some kind of unstable ceasefire which will take place.
Well, I'll take you up there. I recently, in correspondence with news people in England, who said that for the last year there had been talk among the Western governments about some kind of a deal where the Russians kept what they've won, but in turn, Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO, and that would be part of the deal, and that had some serious discussion. But now, with the possibility of change in the United States government, and I assume there are other factors playing into it, that's not being spoken of very much, though stalemate, seems to be the very thing we're staring at.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think if we could get a deal which would stabilize the battlefield right now with the agreement that Ukraine could be part of NATO, I mean, that's probably the best outcome we can possibly imagine at this point. But Putin's not ready to make such a deal. And Zelensky's not ready to make such a deal because Putin's not ready to make the deal because he doesn't want Ukraine in NATO. Zelensky's not willing to make the deal because he refuses to allow the fact that some of the territory of the former Ukraine would ultimately end up in the hands of the Russians. So it's hard to see at this point where the middle ground is going to happen. And it will be interesting to see over the next 6-8 months whether any entity can somehow bridge the gap between those two. I mean, at one point, early on, kind of in a flight of fantasy at this point, I was hopeful that maybe the Chinese could play a positive role in bringing this to closure. But they've become more and more dug in support of Putin, and it seems less and less likely that they can be the arbiter, if you will, between those two. So At least for now, it looks like, unfortunately, the grind will continue. But at some point, and this is where it comes in. At some point, if the pain if enough pain can be inflicted on the Russians in the process, and if the Russian economy, as it mobilizes for a longer war, begins to suffer, and the populace begins to see the impact of this war, perhaps that will change Putin's calculus and make him more willing to consider some kind of compromise position.
Well, let me take up China. Of course, you mentioned it at the start in terms of the sort of diplomatic, geopolitical landscape. Now North Korea has been brought in. I can't think of a more volatile addition. And as a arms supplier and supplying weaponry, and that government should, such as it is, should have any kind of place at the big table in all of this. But China allows that in some sense, because they have a potential way of elbowing or blocking North Korea, and clearly they didn't. So what's at stake for China here? I mean, is it only that, that China, Iran, North Korea, Russia form themselves together against the West, and China gets to do this for free? What pressure points are there on China, and what are they seeking to gain?
Well, I think what you've said is part of it. I mean, the Chinese are happy to have allies in their competition with the United States and with the West. They're getting a lot of cheap oil from Russia, but what unfortunately is happening is that the two sides are hardening. The Western side, the NATO side, and our allies in Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and others in the Pacific, versus Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, and as those positions harden, it's going to be, again, increasingly more and more difficult to come to any kind of middle ground, any kind of meeting of the minds that might ultimately end the catastrophe in Ukraine.
Bleak.
Yes.
When you mention Iran, something obviously comes to mind, which is the state of things in the Middle East. And I wanted to ask you whether Israel and Gaza affect the dynamic in the Ukraine in any way, or is that a moral and debating point that people use in comparison? But is there any linkage there?
I think if there is a linkage, I think it has to do with the populations of the NATO countries. So many folks in France, Germany, other of the Western European countries look at what's going on in Gaza and at the horrors that are going on there, and and are rebelling against their own governments for the positions that they've taken in support of Israel. And in so doing, that kind of undermines the credibility of the governments to operate in other sectors, and that would include Ukraine. And so it has that kind of influence. The other thing, of course, it does is that the Russians, I'm sure, are watching what's going on in Gaza, and they're learning from it. They're taking lessons learned from what the Israelis have done there, and they're going to see how they might or might not apply to the battlefield in Ukraine. Presumably the Ukrainians are doing that as well, but they're in a much more difficult position than the Russians are to pick up on those kind of things.
I don't know if many of you read the piece, I believe it was in a recent New York Times, which is a kind of behind the scenes of when Trump first went to NATO and the EU and, of course, at NATO to push for the 2% GDP contribution. And at that time, I think there were 4 countries that were meeting it. He, threw to the wind protocol, and, his was seriously threatening to pull out of NATO, and just saying that, they weren't meeting their obligations. They were living off the United States, and this was deeply shocking to all of them. Well, now, as you say, there's, been the conformance with their obligation. But it seems to me another current that's maybe germane here is that the Europeans may be realizing much more fully that with any vicissitudes in American politics, they've got to have a stronger, coherent defense capability vis-a-vis Russian expansionism.
Yeah, I think that's right at the intellectual level. I just don't know whether it's going to happen at the practical level. The Europeans, countries need to be spending more on defense. They've needed to spend more on defense for years and years, and I will say that Trump was certainly right. I mean, they've been free riding on the United States for years and years. They have degraded their defense industrial base. They have, the German army is a shadow of what it was at the end of the Cold War. And then you have the politics of it, and with the election in France, the ability of the government, even if it wanted to be able to mobilize and to be able to divert resources to the defense industries and to the military, will be tough to do. And Germany's in the same place. If they are going to spend more on defense, they're going to spend less on the social side. And that's going to cause them political problems within their coalitions and within their populace. One of the things that's happening at the NATO summit is that the organization for the resupply of Ukraine is being shifted from the Department of Defense in the United States to NATO. And that's a hedging strategy on the part of us and the NATO allies in the event that Trump were elected, that there would still be a mechanism there to provide the military resources to the Ukrainians that could be jeopardized if it were being run out of the United States Department of Defense as opposed to out of NATO headquarters.
You mentioned Modi before, and well, he's his own character, but have we reached a point where the world outside of Western Europe, the adjoining countries, and perhaps at some point in big parts of the United States and elsewhere, our patience is getting worn, our attention span is diverted, and for all the haunting powers of the 30s, for those who still believe in history and pay attention to it and have some modicum of knowledge, that we could become in a state of drift, standing back from it all, and what would come of that?
Well, I think that's exactly the calculus that Putin's had in his mind from the very beginning, that basically he could outlast the West, that the West's attention would ultimately be diverted to other requirements, other needs, and that, you know, most over time the American people would say, you know, it's really not worth it. We're not getting anything out of this. We're spending a lot of money that we could be spending at home, and our attention has been diverted. And that certainly is a real challenge. And in the absence of strong leadership on the part of those countries, including the United States, I don't think there's any doubt that that's the direction it will ultimately go. And we can only hope that that somehow or another the denouement of this whole thing happens sooner rather than later, because in truth, unless we're willing to put a lot more resources, a lot more energy, a lot more focus on this than Putin is, the outcome will not be a positive one for Ukraine, and for Europe, and ultimately for the United States.
What haven't I asked you I should have asked you?
I can't think of anything, Steve. I mean, you're a journalist. You ask all the right questions, you know.
That was my way to go. We're going to open it to questions. Tell me, please, if somebody asks a question, should they come up and use the mic, or will it pick it up?
It won't pick it up, but we're not going to broadcast the Q&A.
Oh, okay. You aren't. Well, to those of you online, we appreciate your presence with us. Thank you. All right, I'll